Ohio and good morning everyone. My name is Jared Sheffer and this is part 2 of my Introduction to Java Programming course. In this lesson we're going to be going over conditional statements as well as various types of loops. Now if you have any questions about this lesson or other lessons, feel free to ask them down below in the comments and I'll get back with you as soon as I can. Now without further ado, let's get started. Starting where we left off last time, we had accepted an input and given the output for a specific number. Now what we're going to do is we're actually going to add some conditional logic with if and else statements. So if and else, basically we're either going to do one thing if a Boolean statement, either true or false, is true. Otherwise, we're going to do the other path. So what I'm going to do is actually print out whether or not a number is even or odd. The first thing I'm going to do is create a Boolean variable called isEven. I'm not going to instantiate it to a value because by default the primitive, unlike this object, is false. So the primitive has a false value, whereas like the object, which is capitalized, will have a different default value. But we want to begin with it being false, so we're going to start with isEven Boolean is false. Now to start our conditional statement, we start with if, and then open parentheses, and then we have our condition block with the curly braces. Inside of these parentheses are what our condition statement has to be. This has to either evaluate to a true or a false. If it is true, it will run the code that is within these curly braces, making this Boolean value of isEven equal to true. Now at the bottom here, I'm going to go ahead and print out what our value for isEven evaluates to. I'm going to start by removing the text that was in here. I just want to show that the selected number, I'm going to add a string to it and say isEven. There are a number of important concepts that are going on right now that I kind of want to break down. First is that this statement, this print statement, will always execute because we execute sequentially. So I actually only want to execute this if that value is even. So I'm going to start with putting this inside of a condition block to say isEven. The other thing you'll notice here is that this has a red squiggly line because even though this is a primitive Boolean and has a value of false, IntelliJ wants you to follow best practices and give this a value. So that's what we're going to go ahead and do. In this else statement, we're going to go ahead and set it to false. And I'm going to say that isEven equals to false. So basically, if it's 2, I know that it's even. If it's false, I know that it's not. So this is the beginning of this statement. And then it'll run this and only print out this statement if it's actually even. So when I run this, if I enter 2, I get the expected statement is even. If I run it again and enter a number, any other number such as 3, I get that I've chosen number 3, but I don't get that statement that's in the other else statement in the other if statement because it doesn't run. The problem now is that even if I put in 4, it still doesn't know that it's even. So what we can use is something called a modulus. What modulus does is it gives us the remainder value of a division. So we know that if it's 0, then it's divisible by that number. Using modulus, we're going to take our selected number, do a modulus of 2, and see if the remainder is 0. If you divide something by 2 and the remainder is 0, we know that it is even. Otherwise, we know that it's odd. So I'm going to actually put 2 more lines in here saying that else, if the statement is not even, then I know that it's odd, and I can print out a different text for that. So now this will tell me for every number whether it's even or odd. Now remember, it only runs the first block in the if statement if the condition in the if is true, and it only runs the second statement if it's false. So each one of these blocks will be separated that way. And a good rule of thumb is once you've written out your logic is always to go back and see if there's a way to simplify that. Now that we've demonstrated the idea of modulus, I'm actually going to delete this block statement here, and I'm just going to directly use the modulus statement in this if statement, because essentially what this is doing is it's telling me whether or not the selected number is even or odd. So I don't need to set that to a Boolean variable. I can just use it directly in here. So when I run this, I enter my number of 1, I get the same code as before, the same answer, it's odd. Run it again, I'll get the same output with less lines of code that the answer is even. The next optimization I can do here is actually changing this if-else statement into a ternary statement. And that'll allow us to eliminate some of these lines of code and make it a little bit simpler, and some say even easier to read. As the foundation of my ternary statement, I'm going to use the condition that we have here to check and see whether it's even or odd. Since the only difference of what's printed out in this if or else statement is the word even or odd, I'm actually going to save that off as a string variable based on what is returned from this ternary. So I'm going to go ahead and say string, and I'm going to call this variable even or odd. The next thing you do is set that equal to what this ternary evaluates to. So first thing we have is this condition followed by the question mark. And if the statement is true, it returns the first thing. Otherwise, we have a colon and it returns the second thing. So important things here are the question mark, the colon, and the condition in this. So this will basically do the same thing as our if-else statement, just in fewer lines of code. Now, once we have that string here, I can go ahead and just simply print out that value with the string value of either even or odd, since that's the only thing that's different. So I'm going to go ahead and do a system out.print line, and I'm going to say our selected number is, and the string value of even or odd. And go ahead and format this, and you'll see this has cleaned up a lot of those lines into a single line. This is our other way of writing a simple if-else statement. And you can see I get my 4 is even, evaluates the same way as it did previously. That brings us to the end of conditionals and up to the beginning of loops. In this section, we're going to change the code again a little bit, and we're going to allow the user to basically enter a number as many times as they want in a loop. But to do that, we're first going to remove some of the code that we have here and add what's called a sentinel value in our input. So we're going to go ahead and remove this stuff up here. We're going to save our string sentinel value, and we're actually going to retrieve input from it using input.next. So we're going to say, please enter your name or type stop to end the program. So stop is going to be basically the keyword that we're going to watch. So we're going to say while sentinel value, and we're going to compare it to the word stop. One thing you don't want to do with strings though is you can't really use the same kind of equivalencies that we've done in the past with the equals equals or not equals statements. With strings, there's actually a dot equals value that we're going to use. So we're going to save off this sentinel value because it wasn't initialized or it wasn't declared here. So we're going to go ahead and declare it and initialize it all on one line. And then we're going to say in this while loop, so while sentinel value is not equal to stop, or what you usually want to do if you have a known string value, such as the word stop here, this is our constant, we actually want to put that first, since we know that that value is always constant. It's always going to be stop. And there's various reasons to that. We'll get into that once we start talking about null pointer exceptions. But what we're going to do is we're going to say stop equals, and we're going to go ahead and use ignore case, because in this instance, I don't care if it's capital case or lowercase or mixed case. We just want if the string itself that the user has typed in includes the letters STOP. we want it to go ahead and exit this loop. And if it's equal to that, we can negate that whole statement with the exclamation point. So now this says while stop is not equal to the sentinel value, then we're going to go ahead and run this loop. And it'll run each one of these lines in sequence, and once it gets to the last statement in these curly braces, it'll go ahead and run it again. And it'll continue to run it until that condition inside of that while is no longer true. So I'm going to go ahead and in here, I'm going to go ahead and print another statement, and I'm going to ask the user to enter a number. And I'm going to go ahead and read in that integer. And down here outside of the loop, I'm going to go ahead and remove this code that's no longer needed and put it in here. Go ahead and format some of the code. Okay, now I can go ahead and ask this question again, so that way I can update this sentinel value within my loop. So I'll ask it first to kind of prime the sentinel value and begin the loop, and then I can update this value at the end of the loop. So if I run this, you'll see it actually appears fairly smooth whenever you run it. Go ahead and hit the start button, and it's asking me to enter my name or hit stop to end the program. I'm going to go ahead and say stop. Immediately it exits, no errors, we're all good. I'm going to go ahead and enter my name as Jared. Hit enter on that, and then I'm going to go ahead and enter a number, which is executing line 14 now. If I enter a number, it'll go ahead and prime me for the next sentinel value, and as long as I don't enter stop, it'll continue in this loop and keep asking me. So I'm actually going to clean this up a little bit more, and I'm going to go ahead and add another statement in here to check to see if it's stop at the beginning, then I'm not going to do anything. But if it's not stop, I'm going to go ahead and tell the person hello, since they entered that name and I want to use that value. So I can go ahead and say if it's not equal to stop, then I'm going to go ahead and print the name of that person. System.out.println. And I'm going to say hello followed by the input's name. So now if I run this, if I hit stop, it won't run any of this code inside of this if or the while. But if I input a name, it'll go ahead and run. So if I see this by just entering stop, I get no output. I'm going to go ahead and enter my name for this. I get hello, and it starts that internal loop. Now, if I wanted to eliminate the string sentinel value and I simply just wanted to have it ask for the number over and over and over, I can do that, and I'll show you how to do that next. What I'm going to do is run some simple validation on the input that the user is actually passing in. Currently, we're only reading in the next integer, so if the user types in a string, this code would crash. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to check to see after a user enters their value, if the input has an integer as the value. If it does, I'm going to go ahead and save off that selected number inside of the integer. Otherwise, I'm going to update the sentinel value, because I know if it's not an integer, I'm going to assume that it's the string value that they're asking for. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this. And now we have if input has a next int, meaning if the input that the user has typed in can be rendered as an integer, then I can do all this code to update the numbers. So now I can actually update this string to say enter a number or enter stop to stop the program. So now I can go ahead and run this. I can still do the entering of the name. I'm going to go ahead and enter Jared. And now I get the enter number or stopped in the program. If I say stop, I get the same exit because it'll go into that else on line 21, update the input as a string, and then exit. But I can keep entering all of these numbers in this loop until I hit stop. That's because I'm checking to see if the input is an integer, and if it's not, I'm updating the string value for the Sentinel value. Currently in this code, the only way to exit it is with that Sentinel value, but there's actually a way I can kind of short circuit that and exit as soon as I hit a certain condition. So if I wanted to say if the next input is not an integer, I can actually do what is called a break, and that will break out of the current block of code. And you can see what current block of code it is in by hitting this subtraction sign, and you'll collapse that block of code. So everything that was collapsed is within that code block, and it'll break out of that loop and basically continue on to the next line. So with that break, if I hit that, it'll automatically go to line 24, which is the end of that while statement, and continue any other code that's in it. If I hit stop, you'll see it behaves just the same way as before. So this is a little bit different way of doing the same thing as I had before. This brings us to the end of the lesson on conditionals and while loops. In the next part, we'll actually be going over another type of loops called for loops. If there are any questions from today, make sure you leave a comment down in the comment section below, and I'll try to get to it as soon as I can. And if you enjoyed this video or learned something, make sure you like, subscribe, and I'll see you again next time.